support the amendment?
Is it the amendment in the nature of the substitute, sir?
Yes.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2273.
Without
offered by Mr.
objection,
Shimkus.
the amendment in the nature of a substitute is considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me to explain the substitute amendment. I want to explain to my colleagues not only what this substitute amendment does, but what it does not do. This amendment empowers states, based upon a familiar and relevant system to address the management and disposal of coal combustion residuals, encourages new American job growth in a beneficial use area, prevents increased costs to American consumers, and does it without expanding the size of government. This substitute amendment creates the first ever statutory regime for coal combustion residuals. This substitute amendment requires groundwater monitoring and liners for structures defined as landfills, surface impoundments, and other land-based units. This substitute amendment ensures corrective action when needed for structures with coal combustion residuals. This substitute amendment requires financial responsibility requirements to ensure that the financial resources are there to clean up if it is necessary. This substitute amendment contains more, so now I want to detail some other areas of the substitute. Several members on both sides of the aisle have made important suggestions that are improvements to the substitute. Language was added to allow environmentally protective continuance of the coal combustion residual reuse activities. We strengthened the original structural integrity language to allow states or EPA, depending upon who is running the program, to close not only high hazard impoundments that have structural problems that cannot be fixed, but also any other structure. We added language to capture air and dust concerns. The bill now allows for the detection of several constituents that would indicate whether a leak was happening at the structure. We clarified language on surface impoundments that deals with closure plans and dewatering. The members we worked with may not vote for this bill, some may, but we have made every effort over the last few months to listen and make changes to address gaps in the environmental protection. In all our work, however, we have not compromised on a couple of principles. This substitute amendment does not give EPA a new regulatory charge. It does not impose an unfunded mandate on the states, and it does not handcuff economic growth and environmental protection. I hope members will support this bill, and I know many will. And if you don't, though, I want to understand a few things. First, working to oppose this tacit support is risking that coal combustion residuals be categorized as a subtitle C waste, which I think most of us agree we do not want to do. It is a tacit support for higher energy prices and lower job prospects. It is affirmation in the belief that the federal government knows best and state civil servants are incapable of doing what's right for their neighbors. This is an eminently reasonable amendment on all fronts. Unemployment is at 9.2% and 16.2% when you add in those who gave up the search for work. This is not just an environmental protection bill, it is a real live jobs legislation. The choice between jobs and federal government power is yours. I urge support for jobs in the environment and the substitute amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair would recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to thank the majority for working with us. I know it's been a long process. When both Chairman Shipkus and I and our subcommittee had our first hearing on this, after hearing the testimony, I said this is something we can work on and compromise. Obviously, that and to solve this problem, obviously that's taken much longer than most of us thought. But I want to express my support for the current amendment in the nature of a substitute, because we've gone through a number of drafts. While I don't believe any amendment is perfect and no piece of legislation we ever pass will achieve perfection, this is a work in progress and really a great piece of legislation. If I was the author, we would make it a little different because this legislation represents what Congress is supposed to do. We're supposed to legislate. This year, we spent a lot of time passing bills that have little chance of being signed into law or even being considered by the Senate. The amendment in nature of a substitute for us today is vastly improved over the draft considered in the subcommittee markup. The legislation includes additional assurances that states implementing a coal ash permitting program must meet minimum standards under RCRA to protect human health and the environment. Additionally, this amendment includes a provision championed by my colleague, Mr. Doyle of Pennsylvania, that will ensure adequate closure standards for the surface impoundments, including closure plans and drainage standards. I know there's maybe some additional concerns about this amendment that could not be addressed in the time allocated before the markup. I hope we can work together as we move this legislation to the floor on outstanding issues. And again, I want to reiterate the amendment's not perfect, but it's part of legislating. We're moving this ball forward. And I believe my colleagues on the majority side make significant improvements in their first draft, and they made a great good faith effort in addressing my concerns. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Chair would recognize the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that there's been movement on the majority side to some of the concerns that have been raised by members on the Democratic side. I wish we had had more time to vet this bill. We had a hearing, only one hearing, and it was on a very different approach. We have not had a hearing on the proposal that we're going to be voting on here today. EPA talked to members this morning and gave a very quick off-the-cuff evaluation of the legislation. And then they sent to us a memo saying below are some examples of circumstances where either existing landfill requirements would be inappropriate for surface impoundments or would otherwise cause the risk presented by surface impoundments to be sufficiently or inappropriately addressed, insufficiently or inappropriately addressed. And the examples do not represent an inclusive test. They say there may be other examples, but they say examples where existing Part 258 requirements are not appropriate or do not adequately address surface impoundment risks. 1, closure. 2, design requirements. 3, inspection requirements to surface impoundments. 4, post-closure care requirements differ between surface impoundments and landfills. Examples of risks that are not addressed in the current draft for either landfills or surface impoundments. The runoff and run-on and runoff requirements. The groundwater monitoring requirements. Air criteria. The draft legislation does not establish any minimum criteria for record keeping and inspection. In addition, the current draft fails to establish a substantive safety standard that a state would be required to achieve to protect human health and the environment. Our legacy of this committee has always to put in place laws to protect the public health and the environment, leaving a great deal of latitude to the states so that they could go beyond the federal standard. But we didn't have the states completely in charge, as I fear will continue with this legislation. We had a vigorous debate in the other room how much EPA can do if the state's not doing an adequate job. Mr. Chairman, your lawyers say that you've addressed it. EPA lawyers and my counsel says it's not sufficiently addressed. Now, these are things we can continue to talk about. These are things that ought to be fixed in my view, but I gather on the Republican side you don't want to fix it because, as we are told, this is a different approach. Well, I don't know why we need a different approach to environmental laws than the approach we've taken in the Clean Air Act, the Drinking Water Law, RCRA, and others. So I acknowledge that you've moved. We haven't really had a chance to engage fully on this legislation. And with EPA, this is a major piece of legislation, and I'm not sure it's going to be effective, and I think these deficiencies raise further concerns in my mind. So I want to just indicate to my colleagues that the bill will certainly be going out of committee, but I'm not prepared to vote for it. I'm prepared to continue to discuss it, but I'm not prepared to vote for it. I just want to share my views and wish we could have further deliberations and not have to do things in such a circuitous route that we're not really saying what some people think we're saying, because we don't want other people to think that we're saying what we're being told we're saying. That always makes me nervous. I will vote no, and I yield back my time.
Chairman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This isn't a perfect bill. I've been here 17 years. I don't get to vote on many perfect bills. But sometimes you can't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. We've come a long way on this bill, and I appreciate the fact that the majority's been willing to work with us and address some of the concerns that we have in the bill. We have made important changes to this bill on provisions of the bill affecting wet impoundments. We've actually got additional changes after the letter that Mr. Waxman read from the EPA. We got further changes. We've tightened the standards for closure of wet ponds. We've tightened groundwater monitoring requirements. We didn't get everything. EPA acknowledges that they would have liked to have had more than we got in this bill. But on balance, I believe from the conversations that we've had EPA, and we had, you know, anytime you have 10 or 11 people on the same phone call, sometimes people take away different interpretations of what they heard on the telephone. But I'm convinced that EPA does have the authority to step in if a state is not fulfilling its requirements under the agreement to take this program over. We're going to have an open process on the floor, the chairman tells me. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues to improve this bill further. But we've come a long way, and I appreciate it, and I intend to support the bill here in the full committee and move it to the floor, and look forward to working with my colleagues on further changes to the bill to make it even better. And I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, in the spirit of bipartisanship, I'll say something that I think both sides will dislike.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's Brian Bilbray.
I think one of the things that I favor at the approach of this bill is that anyone who's ever worked with environmental issues in any of the states realize that the most successful environmental regulations are those that empower the local communities to address the problems, not the federal government. Anybody has to look at the condition of the Potomac River and say, I'm not so sure you want the people running the city cleaning up ours. But in fact, the difference, as the gentleman from California pointed out, the difference between the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act is that we learned from mistakes of Clean Water Act and actually empowered the local states to implement, develop the strategy under federal supervision or approval, but actually empowered the locals to take care of their own environment. And the outcome tended to be much better than we've seen with the Clean Water Act. And I can go through all of the shortfalls of Clean Water Act, even though I've disagreed with some members of this committee about implementation of Clean Air Act. I think this bill moves towards the empowerment. And let me just say in closing, it's no secret that I'm not a real great fan of the coal industry, but I darn well want to point out that this is another instance where those who are concerned about the environmental impact of coal have to do a lot more than just dam coal and try to shut down coal. It is a major energy source, major economic ace that the United States has and been able to use for centuries. And that if you really want to avoid these issues, then you darn well have got to do more than just be anti-coal. You've got to be willing to go after technologies that can create robust, large, economically viable energy sources before you're ever going to be able to do what you want to do with coal. And so I've just got to say, I think that this should be an example to all of us that we're going to continue to address these issues until we get aggressive about what we're willing to do to create cost-effective energy in this country rather than what we're willing to always be against. And I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield to me?
Yes, I will.
We've always had the states doing the job, but minimum federal standards. And at the hearing we had, I asked every single witness, do you think there ought to be minimum federal standards? And they responded, yes, there should be. We have some standards set out in this bill, but it's not clear that they're going to be as enforceable. For example, we know whatever would apply to municipal solid waste will apply here, because we're saying whatever applies to municipal solid waste will also apply here, but there are differences between municipal solid waste and the kind of waste that we're regulating.
Well, I'd reclaiming my time. There may be differences, and those may want to be addressed in the scientific aspect. But to point out to you, the standards that are set sometimes by the federal government were standards like secondary treatment requirement for the Clean Water Act under the guise of the Clean Water Act, when you had the National Academy of Science and Scripps Institution of Oceanography telling us the federal government's position was going to hurt the environment. Nobody who drafted the Clean Water Act, I assume, and maybe the gentleman from California can clarify, ever meant that act to hurt the environment. But because of the way the federal government is insensitive to the community and the reality on the ground, you end up having those problems. Now, the same point was the mandates for oxygenated content that the Washington put onto states like New York and California have been proven by the National Academy of Science to be detrimental to the environment. And that kind of mandate from Washington should have never been put onto the locals. The locals had the ability to address the local environmental issue. And with that, I think that we've got to avoid that. So hopefully this starts moving us towards worrying more about outcome rather than process when it comes to our environmental strategy.
Gentlemen, yield further. I hear what you're saying. What I'm saying, however, is that we've always let the states go beyond the minimum, and that's where we get a lot of innovation that's directly related to the environment.
Reclaiming my time, sometimes, though, the minimum that the federal government has set is environmentally damaging and refuses to admit that made a mistake. The problem with Washington, D.C. and federal regulations isn't that we try new things or that we make mistakes. But when we try new things and make mistakes, we're not brave enough to go back and correct it. We just throw more money and more regulations at it.
In the few seconds he has left, right now, existing law lets the states manage this program. I think the reason we have legislation is that we ought to have more than just the states manage it, because there have been problems.
Like Chicago and its wastewater treatment by shipping it down the Mississippi rather than clean up their mess is the reason why we have the Clean Water Act.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair would recognize the gentlelady from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to thank you and Chairman Shimkus for working with my colleagues and me in trying to reach a bipartisan consensus on this piece of legislation. And I also want to thank your staff for their efforts in working across the aisle. When all is said and done, I hope that we can build on this experience as evidence that we can work together to try to solve important and complex issues that come before our committee. I also want to thank you for including additional criteria into the bill, which my colleagues and I had asked for, including financial assurance criteria, air criteria, and the revised language on surface impoundments. Additionally, yesterday I offered an amendment which highlighted the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources comments on EPA's proposed CCR rule. In those comments, they noted that all of the parameters, studied in groundwater monitoring, boron seemed to be the best indicator of groundwater impacts around CCR landfills. I'm pleased to see that boron, sulfate, and other constituents were included in groundwater monitoring requirements. As this process moves forward towards the floor, I hope that additional common sense criteria such as access requirements, runoff control systems, surface water requirements, and record-keeping requirements can be included in the final version of this legislation. And lastly, before committing to support this legislation when it reaches the floor, I will want to review the technical comments that we are expecting from EPA in regard to the full analysis of this latest version of the bill. This is an important issue, and we have to get it right for public health, the environment, and the beneficial reuse industry. And I guess I would be remiss if I didn't once again at least briefly brag about Wisconsin's record in that regard. We're really the gold standard in terms of handling coal combustion wastes. There are no wet ponds in Wisconsin. Our dry landfills are properly lined, covered, and monitored. There is a strong beneficial use reuse program in place. And one utility, We Energies, even achieved a utilization rate of close to 110% last year. And they achieved this extraordinarily high rate because they're one of the only utilities in the country that is currently recovering coal ash from existing landfills and leading it to beneficial reuse. With that said, I thank the chairman and look forward to reviewing those EPA comments prior to consideration of this bill on the floor, and I yield back the balance of my time.
If the gentlelady would yield,
I would be happy to yield.
I just want to reiterate what I said in the back room with a number of Republicans and Democrats in the room, and that is, you know, we do expect this bill to pass this afternoon out of this committee, and certainly I want to congratulate both sides. I want to say that we've been working on this since at least early March, if not February, and Mr. Shimkus has done an outstanding job with his patience, Mr. McKinley, all of us on both sides of the aisle. I think I think we are in a far better position now than we were even several weeks ago. And as I know the style of Speaker Boehner, you look at any of the bills that we've had up on the House floor, this bill will not be up under suspension. Germane amendments have been allowed by Chairman Dreyer on virtually every single bill, which is why by the end of this week we'll probably have some 600 recorded votes on the House floor. Pretty busy schedule for not doing a contract with America like we did back in '94. But I'm sure that we'll be looking at this bill. We'll be listening on amendments.
Gentleman or gentlelady, yield to me to ask the chairman a question. We're going to report the bill out today. We've done this in the past where we've reported a bill out and then still had a hearing on it. I'd like to have a hearing on this bill, maybe before it gets voted on the floor, if that's possible, just so we get the input on this bill, because the hearing we had, I don't think was adequate to talk about the views on this particular piece of legislation. What do you think about that, Mr. Chairman?
I don't know. I don't know when the leadership is going to schedule the bill for the floor. I doubt that it'll be next week. But we'll have it. I think that we'll have a chance to review what EPA says and have a number of.
Well, why don't you just give me a commitment to a hearing whenever?
I don't want to do that quite yet.
Reserving the right to object.
And
I'm not asking unanimous.
I see that the gentlelady's time has expired, so I'll stop and just continue to listen. We'll look at different amendments as they may be prepared for the floor. And gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on
Mr. Chairman?
Substitute? Mr. Dingle.
Thank
Great
you.
State of Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking my colleagues who showed a remarkable level of patience in terms of working to try and resolve the questions that are before us with regard to this amendment. I want to say that I am sorry that I am not satisfied that we have resolved the questions. And we have not yet heard what I think is a clear enough statement of either what the problems are that we're addressing or what the problems are that we will be leaving unaddressed. And I think that's unfortunate. We are making a remarkable change in all of the established environmental laws. When we addressed this the other day, I pointed out that traditionally EPA had come forward with the rules and regulations to be met by the states. The states then had to meet it, and then they could conduct their program, and if they didn't do it right, they would lose control of the program. We came fairly close to doing that, but not close enough, because it is unclear as to whether or not EPA will have the authority to fully regulate the coal ash and other similar substances in a proper way to assure safety. I would very much like to support this amendment, and it may well be that at some future time enough changes will have been made in it that I can. I intend to try and research it. And I hope that we will be able to get enough answers out of it as to what this amendment does that it might even be possible for me to support it. But I don't see that's happening at this particular minute. In any event, we're down here to the point where we're probably going to adopt this. I have to say that I greatly regret, because I've always been curious, if you have a pattern of law which works and a related matter comes up to be addressed under similar law, I've always thought that it made very good sense for everybody to continue that same pattern of regulation. If you don't, the lawyers and the courts and everybody else can wonder, why is it that the Congress made this change? They think we're smart enough to know why we're making these changes. We've asked why it is that it's necessary that we take this jurisdiction essentially away from the state, rather from the EPA, and give it to the states. Let me say, well, we're giving some of it back, but we're saying we don't know exactly how much of it we're giving back. And so I'm not clear how much we're giving back. I'm not clear what embarrassments are going to occur from this, or exactly why it is. I have a great distrust to being badly surprised by changes in the law that are just made to satisfy some political group, and that clearly change the entire structure of the government's regulatory system. I think that there's a very strong possibility that this change will do it. I think the amendment is better than the existing situation. That's a small compliment. I suspect that the amendment is better than it was before the amendment, that the bill would be better with the amendment than it would be without. And so I applaud those things. But it doesn't leave me in a position where I'm able to support it. And I'm very sorry about that. And I hope that as matters go forward, that my friends on the other side of the aisle will work with us so we can get a better understanding of this. And I don't think we have a very good understanding. And so that we can begin to move towards something where we can come out with a bill that will get passed by the Senate, will get signed by the President, and very frankly, will keep the record of this committee, which has always been to legislate very carefully and to know all the consequences of our legislative actions. With that, I have to say I can't support the amendment, probably can't support the bill, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my understanding they've delayed votes on the floor until 5:15. Mr. Chairman, I'm very supportive of this substitute amendment because when I came here 6 months ago, as a sponsor of this bill, we were trying to remove a stigma associated with fly ash. That's what it began. Thousands of jobs could be lost. There's studies that indicate that it could be 184,000 to 316,000 jobs could be lost if this bill weren't passed, because the EPA was considering putting this under a subsection C, and we were simply trying to prevent that from happening, protecting the jobs. That's what this bill began, was removing the stigma so that when people make fly ash out of it, when they put it in concrete, that it does not carry that stigma of a hazardous material. Now, over the 6 months since I introduced the bill, I've seen the process work here in Washington, and I'm not a very patient person, but Congressman Doyle's taught me to be a little patient. I'm working with that, Congressman, because I've seen how the process, we're actually reaching out here in a way, we're getting some bipartisanship where people are understanding that we can't afford to have this be a hazardous material. And without this passage of this bill, we run the risk of the EPA condemning this product in a subsection C, and you have to go back and look at, again, the chart. All these plants all these facilities are creating fly ash. It's not just the East. It's just not the Midwest. It's from California all the way across. 48 of the 50 states are creating fly ash every day. We've got to find a way to handle this. And the adoption of this amendment goes to the very heart of that. Voting against this amendment allows the EPA more of an opportunity to make it a subsection C, and then we have some real jobs problems. I've heard time and time again people talk about the hazardous material list. I'm not going to deny that there are some concern, but a lot in the last few days have been discussing mercury. This is the characteristic of mercury down here. This is the level. The level of mercury would have to be 2,000 times more than is in fly ash now to reach the level of toxicity. There's a scare tactic here. I think in my heart there are people here that don't want us burning coal. And this is a vehicle to make that stop burning coal. Because the contaminants are no worse than soil in a person's yard. This is another study that indicates the toxicity level of fly ash versus soil. The soil is in the dots. Fly ash is down below. In almost every case, it's less toxic than is in your soil. I'm going to defend the coal industry all across America. 25 of our states burn coal, make coal, mine it and ship it to the 48 that burn it. And I think it's time we stand up for those jobs, and we've got an opportunity here with this amendment, and I'm very supportive of this. The bill's come a long way. It was a very simplistic approach initially, but it's matured now to something that's far more dynamic, far more possible of getting past the Senate and being signed by the President. And I applaud all the efforts. I applaud all the folks that have indicated from the other side that they would support that. Yes, it's not perfect, but we're worried about 300,000 jobs being lost if we don't do something. So a no vote here, to me, is embracing the loss of jobs. And when we have the situation we have in this country right now, we cannot afford that, nor can we afford any further attack on this war on coal. It's got to stop. So I ask, please, that you would look very seriously at supporting this amendment and then passing the bill overall. Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we just got this about 5 minutes ago. No more than 10 minutes ago. We don't know what's in this bill, this amendment. We don't know other than the heading on it. We haven't had any chance to read anything about this legislation, this amendment. And Mr. Chairman, I really don't think that, I thought that this committee, and I'm proud of this committee, and I'm proud of what this committee has been able to accomplish during the years that I've been on this committee as a member. And the one thing that I have always felt very proud of in terms of this committee, in terms of its legacy and its history, is that it's been a committee that deliberated on the issues. It's a deliberative body, a legislative body that takes its work seriously and spend time on the difficult issues, on the complex issues that's before this committee. And Mr. Chairman, I think that right now, what we are in a mode to accomplish, what we're trying to do now, we're trying to move legislation based on some politics, based on the extreme positions of a narrow political entity in this nation. And Mr. Chairman, is forcing us to move with undue haste in terms of deliberating on legislation. And Mr. Chairman, in this instance, I know that haste will make waste. We're going to regret the actions because we have not reached any kind of consensus. We have not actually had a chance to study the amendment, to read the amendment, and to understand what it is that we're voting on. And the majority is asking us to come on and vote now, asking us to shoot first and ask questions later. Mr. Chairman, I'm from a coal-producing state. I certainly don't have, have not declared any war on coal. As a matter of fact, I'm an advocate for the coal industry. But I do know that the coal industry, just like every other industry in this nation, has to be responsible and has to be held accountable. All right? There's no industry in this nation that operates that should be accountable to the American people and to the consumers, including the coal industry. I'm not just for giving the coal industry carte blanche because they're having some difficulty to do anything and everything that they want to the people of this nation, to the environment in this nation, to the consumers of this nation. I'm not in favor of just giving them this carte blanche power. Mr. Chairman, my request simply is this. I know you all got the votes. You're going to move this. You're going to move it, and you're going to vote on it, and you're going to create legislative fly ash because you're going to do it with haste. I just simply request, humbly, Mr. Chairman, that at some point in time, in the next few days, we'll be here next week, once you vote this out of this committee, would you please allow the members of this committee on both sides of the aisle to have a hearing to figure out what it is that you're asking us to vote on today. You're going to pass this. But let's come back after you pass it. Let's return back to this room, this very room, and let's have a hearing so we'll know what it is that we're voting on.
Gentlemen, yield to me.
I yield to the ranking member.
I think a purpose of a hearing is not to find out what we voted on, but if we're going to work together as this bill moves forward to understand very specifically what the bill does and doesn't do so that we can, on a bipartisan basis, improve the bill. That's why I would join in your request. We do have a light week next week. Maybe that's something where the chairman can accommodate us. But I join you in your request, and I think it would be helpful not just to understand what we're doing, but to make sure that what we're doing can be improved upon as we move forward. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to take 5 minutes. I've not been a direct participant in the negotiations on this bill. I've attended some of the hearings, and I've been made aware of the negotiations by staff. But just as a general observation, I'd like to say that, number one, there's no full committee chairman on the Republican side that's more interested in bipartisanship than you are. You made it a de facto rule of the committee that bipartisan amendments are given priority and are debated first, and your inclination is to accept them if at all possible. In this particular negotiation, there has been a very open door policy for any member that wished to participate on both sides of the aisle, and I know for a fact that Mr. Doyle and Mr. Green and Mrs. Baldwin have participated on the minority side in addition to Mr. Waxman. And I know on our side all the members that wanted to were allowed to, and it's obvious that Mr. McKinley has had a great deal of input into this compromise. If we're really about bipartisanship and compromise, this is a good place to start, Mr. Chairman. This bill, as has been pointed out, is not the perfect bill, but there's nobody on either side of the aisle can say with a straight face that EPA has acted perfectly in anything the last several years. And this at least rebalances the equation somewhat while still giving the EPA, I don't know if you'd say priority or final say if they feel it's necessary. So I would hope that when it comes time for a vote that members on both sides could vote for this product. I know that what you said in those negotiations that were happening as late as 15 minutes, as recently as 15 minutes ago, was that the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, has operated the Rules Committee in an open fashion, and that you were not aware of any amendment on any bill that is germane to the bill that has been denied. So if there is still work to be done, we have ample time between now and when you decide to take the bill to the floor to do a bipartisan amendment or a series of amendments. This coal ash issue is a real issue. It has real economic impact, as Mr. McKinley has pointed out. And on the minority side, the issues that are being addressed are in most cases either district specific or at least state specific to those members that are addressing them. And you and Mr. Shimkus have had a very open mind to some of those issues. So again, if we're really about bipartisanship, Mr. Chairman, and you certainly are, and Mr. Waxman indicates that he is too, this is a good place to start. This is a decent work product, and I think it is well deserving of support on both sides of the aisle. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I think we're getting close to voting on the substitute. Are there other members wishing to speak on the substitute? Seeing none, vote now occurs on the substitute offered by Mr. Shimkus. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the substitute is agreed to. Are there other...
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask the roll call vote. Mr. Chairman, right here.
We'll do that. Can we do it on final? We'll do it on final. Can we do it on final? We just voted on the substitute. Yeah. Yeah. Are there other amendments to the substitutes? Seeing none. The question now occurs on favorably reporting the bill as amended to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The ayes appear to have it. Mr. Chairman, on that, roll call vote is requested. The clerk will read the roll.
Mr. Barton. Aye. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Aye. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Aye. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Mrs. Bonomack. Mrs. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Aye. Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray, aye. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman, nay. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, nay. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, nay. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. No. Mr. Pallone, nay. Mr. Rush. No. Mr. Rush, nay. Ms. Eshu. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, nay. Mr. Green. Yes. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, nay. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, nay. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, nay. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, nay. Mrs. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, nay. Mr. Upton.
Votes aye.
Mr. Upton, aye.
Members wishing still to cast a vote, Mr. Ross.
Mr. Ross, aye.
Ms. Capps.
Ms. Capps, nay.
Mr. Stearns.
Mr. Stearns, aye.
Dr. Burgess.
Mr. Burgess, aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote. Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman?
Wait, let me just give one more clear. Any member wishing to vote? Clerk will report the tally.
On that, there were 35 ayes, 12 nays.
35 ayes, 12 nays. The bill is favorably reported.
Mr. Chairman.
And
Mr. Chairman.
just 1 second. And the minority is recognized for the requisite number of days to file their
Yes,
reviews.
we wish to have a requisite number of time for the minority to
and,
file our views.
Direct the staff to make any typographical corrections as they may do. And the committee stands adjourned.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Rush.
I had a request that we have a hearing next week.
I heard.
Are you taking that into consideration?
If the gentleman yield, it'd be just like the health care request for a hearing after that was passed.